In the early 2000s, dropping your phone wasn't a crisis. You'd pick it up, brush off the dust, and keep walking. These devices earned a reputation for being nearly indestructible. This chart shows global mobile phone market share in 2006. One company sits at the absolute top, controlling 40.4% of the entire industry. That company was Nokia. To put that dominance into perspective, Apple's highest ever market share for the iPhone peaks at around 25%. Nokia's footprint was nearly double. At this scale, Nokia functioned as a global utility. Consumers bought these devices because they were the standard, and the brand was synonymous with the very idea of a mobile phone. Yet in just a few short years, this massive corporation, holding nearly half the planet's market share, would face total existential erasure. Nokia reached a peak of hardware engineering that eventually became their greatest liability. Their absolute mastery of the physical world left them unprepared for the rise of software. To understand how Nokia thought about phones, you have to go back to their headquarters in Espoo, Finland. They did not start in high-tech computing. Their roots go back to the 19th century, operating as a gritty paper and rubber manufacturer. That heavy industrial DNA hardwired their corporate mindset to view mobile phones as physical commodities. Their instinct was to solve problems through mass manufacturing and material science. This graphic shows the three core pillars that made their devices globally successful. A Nokia phone had to be cheap to build, the battery needed to last for weeks, and the outer shell had to survive almost any physical abuse. To hit that first pillar of cost, they mastered global supply chains. Their sterile factory lines churned out millions of identical units for pennies on the dollar, undercutting every other competitor on the market. Their monopoly was built on brute force physical engineering. They won the global market by stamping out hardware more efficiently than anyone else on Earth. Inside the company, engineers spent a decade locked in intense technical optimization. They poured immense resources into mastering complex, tangible problems like cellular radio frequencies and antenna placement. They developed an unparalleled command over physical materials, specifically figuring out how to push the absolute limits of high-volume plastic injection molding. This obsession trickled down to microscopic details. Teams of engineers were dedicated solely to refining the exact tactile click feel of these plastic keypads, ensuring every single button press felt consistent across millions of devices. This strategy was entirely rational at the time. Relentlessly polishing the physical hardware was exactly what drove their massive profit margins year after year. Over time, the entire culture inside these modern campuses formed around a single objective: protecting and polishing this hyper-efficient, hardware-centric machine. But by transforming into the ultimate masters of the physical world, Nokia engineered an organizational blindness to the digital one. This chart visualizes a business concept known as the innovator's dilemma. When a company directs all its resources towards perfecting its current successful product, the flat plateau here, it misses the rise of a disruptive technology curving upward from below. While Nokia was optimizing plastic in Finland, a completely different design philosophy was quietly brewing 6,000 miles away in Cupertino, California. The core tenet of this new Californian approach was a complete apathy toward the physical hardware that Nokia prized so highly. Apple viewed the phone as a blank glass vessel. The physical device was merely a delivery mechanism for a fluid software experience. These ideologies were colliding. Espoo built static physical keypads, while Cupertino built fluid digital ecosystems. Nokia's historical pillars of durability and battery life became secondary metrics. Consumers began prioritizing the capabilities of a mobile computer over the reliability of a simple communication tool. Mastering the rules of the current market provides absolute zero protection when a competitor manages to change the nature of the product itself. In January 2007, Steve Jobs stood on stage and slid his finger across a glowing piece of glass. That smooth unlocking motion sent the keynote crowd into a roar. But inside Nokia's executive suite, the reaction was dismissive. They evaluated the device and saw no reason to panic. To Nokia's engineering purists, The iPhone was a fragile, unreliable piece of hardware that failed every internal quality benchmark they had. Their confidence was rooted in decades of physical engineering excellence. They believed they were playing a game that Apple didn't understand. The first iPhone dropped calls, it lacked a physical keyboard for typing, and the screen shattered the moment it hit a hard surface. Nokia dominated the market by building devices that felt indestructible, characterized by dense, tactile keypads and thick, reinforced casings. Their internal testing was brutal. A phone only passed if it could survive a violent drop onto solid concrete without the screen or casing cracking. Nokia's internal reports labeled the Apple device a toy, a poorly engineered novelty rather than a serious communication tool. They remained focused on their status as the world leaders in physical engineering, while the actual requirements of the market were changing in the background. The moment the iPhone launched, the very definition of a mobile device changed. Phones were no longer judged solely as durable communication tools. They became pocket-sized computers that happened to make calls. This shift moved the battleground away from hardware engineering and into software architecture. Nokia couldn't move with the market because their physical empire was built on a broken digital foundation. That foundation was an operating system called Symbian. In the late 90s, it was a lean, efficient piece of software designed to run on incredibly weak processors. By 2007, that efficiency had turned into a massive accumulation of technical debt, making the system as fragile as a house of cards. Writing Symbian code was agonizing. Engineers drafted thousands of lines of low-level instruction just to create a single drop-down menu. And because it was tightly coupled to hardware, Nokia had to write a bespoke version for every new phone model. This internal friction turned Symbian into a digital swamp, making it impossible for Nokia to keep pace with the software-first approach of their new competitors. Nokia's leadership continued to demand indestructible hardware, while failing to address the extreme fragility of their own software. As the software-led model took over the market, Nokia's dominance collapsed. This chart shows how quickly their lead vanished once the market pivoted. Their failure resulted from a perfect optimization for a hardware-first world that had already ended. They spent years refining an outdated system, proving that long-term success often requires the willingness to abandon the very architecture that built the company. In the early 2000s, if you owned a cell phone, you likely owned a Nokia. They were the undisputed kings of the mobile market, producing devices defined by their tactile physical keypads and indestructible builds. But behind closed doors, in their research labs, engineers were already playing with the future. Years before Apple launched the iPhone, Nokia's teams were successfully swiping on glowing glass prototypes and building early versions of app stores. If Nokia already possessed the exact engineering talent and the working technology required to win the smartphone war before it even started, their subsequent disappearance from the market seems impossible. The answer didn't surface until 2015, when a landmark academic study conducted extensive interviews with dozens of former Nokia executives and middle managers. These interviews laid bare a corporate culture entirely dominated by collective fear. The researchers discovered that Nokia was destroyed by its own internal psychology rather than a failure to innovate. Having superior technology in your labs offers zero advantage if your organization's internal structure acts as a firewall, preventing the truth from reaching the people in charge. The problem started at the top. Nokia's executive leadership had built their careers manufacturing hardware. They knew supply chains and plastics, but they possessed very little deep technical competence in software development. When Apple launched iOS, the consumer's focus shifted instantly from the physical handset to the software within it. This transition made Nokia's hardware-centric business model dangerously vulnerable and sent leadership into a state of panic. This animated diagram shows how leadership reacted. From the executive tier at the top, they imposed aggressive, short-term quarterly targets onto the rest of the company, demanding an instant touchscreen device to match Apple. They expected a software miracle on a hardware timeline. But complex operating systems cannot be rewritten or spun up in a single quarter. When leadership dictates an impossible schedule from the top down, the gap between the executive timeline and technical reality becomes too wide to bridge. Yet the culture makes it impossible for anyone to admit the goal can't be met. Down on the ground floor, the software engineers lived in a completely different reality. They were working with Nokia's proprietary operating system, known as Symbian. The engineers knew precisely what Symbian was: structurally archaic and completely unsuited for the fluid, responsive touch interfaces that consumers suddenly expected. They concluded that to build a proper competitor, the company would have to scrap Symbian entirely and spend several years developing a modern operating system from scratch. Standing between the engineers' technical truth and the executives' demands were Nokia's middle managers. Their job was to filter data upward, but top executives routinely intimidated these managers. If a manager brought bad news or asked for more time, leadership accused them of lacking ambition, directly threatening their upward mobility. Looking at our organizational chart, factual data from the engineers arrives at the middle management tier. To protect their jobs, those managers chose to lie. As that data traveled up to the executive tier, the truth mutated into complete fiction. Back on the ground floor, the engineering department was forced to endlessly patch a sinking ship, simply because their managers had already promised the board a flawless voyage. When leadership makes telling the truth equivalent to career suicide, an organization's middle layer will inherently abandon corporate loyalty in favor of personal survival. Back at the top of the hierarchy, the consequences of this corrupted data flow took hold. Nokia's leadership was now operating inside a completely false reality. Fed nothing but optimistic timelines and status reports, executives sat in their boardrooms toasting to imaginary victories, genuinely believing they were winning the smartphone war. But you can't fake a final product. Devices like the Nokia N8 eventually hit the market running that patched-together Symbian system. The resulting public interface was cluttered, unintuitive, and outmatched. This massive disconnect between what the executives believed they were building and what was actually shipping to consumers directly triggered the rapid collapse of what was once the world's largest phone manufacturer. Nokia's fall reveals a strict limit on any large organization. A company is only as intelligent as the fidelity of its internal communication pipeline. Using intimidation and fear as management tools does not make a workforce more productive. It simply trains employees to become highly skilled at hiding the truth. Creating an environment where employees can safely deliver bad news without facing punishment is a mandatory survival mechanism for any business trying to navigate a changing world. For over a decade, Nokia was the undisputed titan of the mobile world. Their hardware wasn't a luxury. It was a global utility, found in the pockets of nearly 500 million people. But by 2010, the landscape shifted. Apple's iOS and Google's Android introduced fluid, touch-based systems that made physical keypads and styluses feel like relics of a previous decade. Against these responsive new interfaces, Nokia's own Symbian operating system felt its age. It was sluggish, prone to crashes, and users were beginning to actively reject it in favor of smoother alternatives. To stop the decline, Nokia turned to Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, hired to dismantle the old bureaucracy and save the company. In 2011, Elop issued a memo that used a haunting metaphor. Nokia was standing on a burning oil rig. Surrounded by fire, the company couldn't stay where it was. It needed to jump into the unknown to survive. This data shows the resulting collapse. Between 2010 and 2013, Nokia's smartphone market share underwent a vertical decline, confirming that Elop's warning was rooted in a brutal reality. But the survival of a company depends on more than just recognizing the fire. When Nokia finally jumped from the platform, they aimed for a landing zone that proved to be just as dangerous as the flames. Nokia had a clear alternative: adopting Google's Android. By 2011, Android was already the open standard for hardware manufacturers, providing an immediate library of apps and a ready-made user base. Instead, they chose an exclusive, high-stakes partnership with Microsoft to build devices for the Windows Phone platform. Leadership believed Nokia's massive manufacturing scale was enough to single-handedly force a third major ecosystem into the market, regardless of what competitors were doing. This decision committed Nokia to a simultaneous two-front war. They were now fighting the established dominance of Apple and the rapid expansion of Google at the same time. By betting exclusively on Microsoft, the executive team assumed their historical dominance in hardware would be enough to dictate the software reality of the new mobile era. The Lumia was a masterclass in design, beautifully crafted, the world's finest hull. But survival now depended on a software ecosystem of third-party developers. Windows Phone had almost no developer momentum. The App Store remained empty, leaving Nokia's elite hardware trapped. Inside Nokia, the internal communication lines were breaking down. Engineers saw the lack of apps and the technical friction firsthand, but reports of these failures often stalled before reaching the boardroom. This created a chasm within the company. At the bottom, engineering teams were struggling with a software environment that was largely empty. At the top, strategy remained committed to a plan that ignored those technical warnings. They had successfully engineered a flawless ship, but they had failed to notice that the ocean around them had already frozen into solid ice. By 2013, the numbers were undeniable. Nokia's global share of the smartphone market had effectively hit zero. In a final capitulation, Nokia sold its entire mobile division to Microsoft for $7.2 billion. This chart compares that $7.2 billion price tag to Nokia's peak historical value. The difference represents hundreds of billions of dollars in market value that simply evaporated. Nokia's workforce hadn't suddenly lost their ability to innovate. The Lumia line proved they could still produce world-class industrial design that rivaled any competitor. The failure was structural. When leadership becomes insulated from technical friction, the link between engineering reality and executive strategy snaps. They were perfecting the old world while the new one moved past them. Optimization of the old world will never save you from the architectures of the new.
If you enjoyed this mini, subscribe right now so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like, share it with a friend, and comment your thoughts. What would you do? All right, subscribe, like, comment, and share. Thanks for being here.